It was a typical day for Jasmine, a 15-year-old high school student, until it wasn't. She sat at her desk in Ms. Thompson's class, quietly working on her assignment. Jasmine was always a dedicated student. She loved learning and never caused trouble. But today, something strange happened. Ms. Thompson, her teacher, suddenly turned to her, her face stern. "Jasmine, you're disrupting the class. I need you to leave right now," she said sharply, pointing to the door. Jasmine was taken aback. Disrupting the class? She hadn't said anything, nor had she done anything wrong. She raised her hand respectfully, as she had been taught to ask for help with her assignment. But Ms. Thompson wasn't listening. Jasmine, confused and trying to stay calm, stood up to explain herself. "I didn't mean to disrupt anything. I just had a question," Jasmine said, her voice steady but soft. But Ms. Thompson wasn't having it. "No more talking. You're suspended for the rest of the day," she said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Suspended? Jasmine couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had never been suspended before. She had always followed the rules. And yet, here she was, being treated unfairly by someone who was supposed to support her education. As Jasmine walked out of the classroom, she felt a wave of confusion and frustration. Why was this happening? Had her teacher really suspended her for asking a simple question? But what Jasmine didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Her father, Mr. Andrews, was about to get involved, and he wasn't going to let this go easily. When he learned of the suspension, he knew he had to act. This wasn't just about his daughter being wronged. It was about racism and injustice in a place where students should feel safe and respected. What would Mr. Andrews do when he stepped into the school? Jasmine had always been a hardworking and respectful student. She loved school, loved learning, and dreamed of becoming a doctor one day. Her parents had always pushed her to do her best, and Jasmine worked hard to meet their expectations. She was determined to succeed. But there was something Jasmine had learned at an early age. Being a black girl in a predominantly white school wasn't always easy. It wasn't just the schoolwork or the teachers. Sometimes it was the way people looked at her, the assumptions they made because of her skin color. Jasmine had seen it before. Teachers who didn't believe in her potential, classmates who ignored her, or even worse, made rude comments. Jasmine had always handled it the best way she knew how, by staying quiet, staying focused on her goals and working harder than anyone else to prove she was just as good as anyone else. Her father, Mr. Andrews, was someone Jasmine could always turn to. He was a lawyer and an advocate for justice and equality. He had taught her from a young age to always stand up for herself, to never let anyone take away her dignity or her rights. He'd told her, "You're as good as anyone, Jasmine. Never let anyone make you feel less than that. If something's wrong, you stand up and you fight for what's right." Mr. Andrews had always been a strong influence in her life. As a civil rights lawyer, he had fought for many people who had been treated unfairly, and he had often reminded Jasmine how important it was to make sure others were treated with respect, no matter their race or background. But even with her father's teachings, Jasmine still felt the sting of racism in her school. She had been in Ms. Thompson's class for most of the year. Ms. Thompson, a teacher in her 40s, had always seemed a bit cold towards her. Jasmine had noticed that Ms. Thompson would often call on other students, even when Jasmine had her hand raised. It was as if she didn't even see her. Over the past few months, Ms. Thompson had made several comments about Jasmine's work, some that felt personal and harsh, even though Jasmine had always handed in her assignments on time and worked hard to get good grades. Comments like, "Are you sure this is your work?" or "Maybe you need extra help to understand this." Jasmine never said anything, because she knew better than to cause trouble, but deep down, she felt something wasn't right. She had been singled out. This incident, the suspension, was just the latest in a series of events that made Jasmine feel like Ms. Thompson didn't believe in her. Why was Ms. Thompson treating her this way? Jasmine had always been respectful, always asked questions when needed, and had never caused a problem in class. So why had Ms. Thompson taken things so far? Jasmine didn't know how to explain it. She wasn't the type to raise a fuss. But this time, something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about the suspension. It was about something bigger. It was about how people judged her for who she was, simply because of the color of her skin. Jasmine knew she couldn't let this go. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had ever felt treated differently because of the color of their skin, for anyone who had ever been misunderstood or mistreated. When Jasmine's father found out about the suspension, he was furious. He knew this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. This was about racism, plain and simple. His daughter had been wronged, and he wasn't about to sit by and let it go unchallenged. Mr. Andrews had spent his life fighting for civil rights, and now he was going to do whatever it took to fight for his daughter. He knew that Jasmine had the strength to stand up for herself, but he was going to make sure that the school and the teacher understood how serious this was. He wouldn't let them sweep it under the rug. "Jasmine, you did the right thing by standing up for yourself," Mr. Andrews said to his daughter when he got the news. "But now, we need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We will fight for justice, and I'll be right by your side the whole time." It was a typical school day for Jasmine. At least, it started out that way. She arrived early, sat down at her desk, and got ready for another lesson in Ms. Thompson's class. The classroom was full of students, talking, laughing, and preparing for the day's work. But Jasmine was already focused, working on her homework before class officially started. Ms. Thompson had always been a bit cold towards Jasmine, but today, something felt different. It wasn't the normal indifference Jasmine had grown used to. Today, there was a tension in the air. As Ms. Thompson began the lesson, she asked the class to solve a math problem on the board. Jasmine, as usual, raised her hand to answer, hoping to contribute. She knew the answer and wanted to share it. But Ms. Thompson, instead of calling on Jasmine like she had done for the other students, ignored her and picked another child to answer the question. Jasmine sat back, feeling a little frustrated, but she kept quiet. She had been ignored many times before, so it didn't surprise her. But when Jasmine raised her hand again to ask a follow-up question about the next part of the lesson, things took a sudden turn. "Jasmine, stop disrupting the class," Ms. Thompson snapped. Her voice was loud and sharp, drawing the attention of the entire room. Jasmine was stunned. She had simply raised her hand to ask a question, something she had done countless times before. What had gone wrong? "I wasn't disrupting anything, I just had a question," Jasmine said, her voice trembling but still polite. Her heart began to race. She had never been treated like this before. Ms. Thompson, however, wasn't interested in hearing Jasmine's explanation. "I said stop. Go to the principal's office. You're suspended for the rest of the day," she ordered, pointing to the door. Jasmine felt her stomach drop. Suspended? What was going on? She had never been in trouble before. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this happening? Jasmine stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. The other students were silent, watching the scene unfold, but no one said anything. They just stared at her. It felt like the room was closing in around her. "You'll regret this, Ms. Thompson. I didn't do anything wrong," Jasmine said, her voice shaking with frustration. She was scared, but she also felt something else: anger. She couldn't believe this was happening. As she left the classroom, she felt a mix of emotions, confusion, fear, and now hurt. What had she done to deserve this? She couldn't understand why Ms. Thompson would treat her this way, and she felt completely alone. Was it because of her race? Was that the reason the teacher had picked on her today? Jasmine walked slowly down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to go to the principal's office, but she had no choice. She felt like everything she had worked for had just been thrown away. She had been suspended for no reason other than her teacher's judgment. When Jasmine reached the principal's office, she explained what happened to Principal Jenkins. She told him that she had only raised her hand to ask a question, but Ms. Thompson had reacted harshly and sent her away. But, to Jasmine's surprise, the principal didn't seem to believe her. He didn't question Ms. Thompson's version of events at all. "You'll need to take the rest of the day off. We'll figure this out," the principal said, brushing off Jasmine's concerns. Jasmine left the office feeling more confused than ever. No one was listening to her. She had always been a good student, never causing trouble, and yet, here she was, being punished for asking a simple question in class. She felt like she was being treated differently, not because of her behavior, but because of who she was. It was only when Jasmine got home that she finally got the support she needed. Her father, Mr. Andrews, was waiting for her, and as soon as he saw her, he knew something was wrong. "Jasmine, what happened?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Through her tears, Jasmine explained what had happened: the accusation, the suspension, and the fact that the principal didn't believe her. She told him everything, and as she spoke, her father's face hardened with anger. "This is not right, Jasmine," Mr. Andrews said firmly. "You did the right thing by speaking up, but this is bigger than just one teacher. We need to take action." Jasmine looked up at him, surprised. She knew her father had fought for justice before, but she hadn't expected him to get involved in her school situation. But as Mr. Andrews listened to her, it became clear that this wasn't just about one teacher's bad day. It was about something much deeper. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a case of racial prejudice in the classroom, and Jasmine wasn't going to let it slide. She had the right to be treated fairly, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even a teacher, take that away from her. "I'm going to the school tomorrow," Mr. Andrews said, his voice filled with determination, "and we're going to get this straightened out. No one treats my daughter like this." Jasmine felt a sense of relief wash over her. Her father was ready to fight for her, just like he always had for the people he represented in court. He wasn't going to let the school ignore what had happened. The next day, Jasmine's father, Mr. Andrews, was determined to take action. He couldn't stand to see his daughter treated so unfairly. As a lawyer and a civil rights advocate, he had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he would fight for his daughter. The anger he felt about how Jasmine was treated was like a fire inside him. He was ready to confront the school and make sure they understood how serious this situation was. Mr. Andrews was well known in their town for his work in civil rights and his fight against racial discrimination. He had helped many people who were wronged by the system, but he had never been in a situation like this, one where his own daughter was the victim. He knew that, in this case, he couldn't just let things go. Jasmine felt both relieved and nervous. Her father had always been her role model. He was strong, confident, and unafraid to stand up to those who misused their power. But even with her father's strength beside her, Jasmine couldn't help but feel anxious. She knew that going against a teacher and the principal would not be easy, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. When Mr. Andrews walked into the school the next morning, the atmosphere shifted immediately. He was a man who commanded attention, and everyone in the office knew that something serious was about to happen. The secretary, who had always been friendly and polite, suddenly seemed nervous. She immediately called for the principal. "Mr. Andrews." Principal Jenkins greeted him, but his tone was a little uneasy. "How can I help you?" "I'm here to talk about the suspension of my daughter," Mr. Andrews said firmly, his voice steady. "I want to know why she was treated the way she was." The principal's face tightened. He had already received a report about the situation, but he had hoped it would be forgotten, swept under the rug. He had never expected Mr. Andrews to get involved so quickly. But now there was no turning back. "Well, Jasmine was disruptive in class," the principal started, his voice faltering slightly. "She was asked to leave because she wasn't following the rules." "That's not what happened," Mr. Andrews cut in. "I've heard my daughter's side of the story, and I know this was not a case of disruption. You and Ms. Thompson are ignoring the fact that my daughter was singled out, and that's not just about bad behavior. This is about racial bias." Principal Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had always tried to avoid these kinds of confrontations, but today he could feel the pressure mounting. He had to deal with this issue, and the truth was starting to show. "I don't believe there was any bias here," the principal said, trying to hold his ground, but his voice lacked confidence. Mr. Andrews didn't back down. "Let me remind you, Principal Jenkins," he said, "my daughter has never been in trouble before. She's a good student, a respectful student. Why is it that when she asks a simple question, she is treated like this?" Jasmine's heart raced as she listened from the doorway. Her father's words were powerful, and she could see that the principal was starting to understand that this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was racial discrimination. She had always known it, but hearing her father speak about it so clearly made everything feel real. "I want to know why Ms. Thompson felt the need to escalate the situation," Mr. Andrews continued. "Why wasn't she willing to listen to my daughter's side of the story? Why was she so quick to suspend her? This is not acceptable." The principal looked down at his desk, clearly uncomfortable. He had been trying to avoid admitting anything, but Mr. Andrews wasn't letting him off the hook. He had no choice but to face the truth. "I'll be honest," the principal said after a long pause. "We've received complaints about Ms. Thompson's treatment of students before, but this is the first time it's been reported as seriously as it has with your daughter." At this moment, Mr. Andrews knew they were getting somewhere. The principal had just admitted that there were previous concerns about Ms. Thompson's behavior. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern of discrimination. "I'm going to make sure the school conducts a thorough investigation into this," Mr. Andrews said, "and if it's found that my daughter was discriminated against, I'll take this further. We will not let anyone get away with treating her this way." The principal, now realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded slowly. "We will investigate it, Mr. Andrews. I assure you, we'll look into it carefully." "Good," Mr. Andrews said, standing up. "I expect a response soon. I'll be following up on this, and if the investigation is not fair or thorough, we will take this to the next level." As he walked out of the office, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her father had stood up for her, and now they were one step closer to making sure this wouldn't happen to anyone else. She had always admired her father's strength, but now she felt like she had a part in it too. The investigation into Ms. Thompson's behavior was underway, but the tension in the school was growing. Jasmine couldn't focus on her schoolwork. The whole ordeal kept replaying in her mind. She had never expected something like this to happen at her school. She had always been taught that education was a place where everyone should be treated equally and with respect, but now her faith in that belief was shaken. Her father, Mr. Andrews, was persistent. He met with the principal several times and spoke with school board members. He made sure to keep pushing for a thorough investigation, determined not to let this injustice go unnoticed. Jasmine was proud of her father, but also nervous. What would happen next? Would the school stand behind her, or would they protect their teacher? As the investigation continued, Jasmine's classmates began to talk. Some of them supported her, sharing their own stories of how Ms. Thompson had treated them unfairly. Some of them, however, were silent. They avoided getting involved, unsure of what to say or do. Jasmine knew that silence from the rest of the students meant that nothing would change. It wasn't long before the school announced the results of the investigation. Ms. Thompson had been found guilty of racial discrimination. The evidence was clear. She had treated Jasmine unfairly based on her race. There had been reports from other students, some who had been afraid to speak up at first, but now, after hearing Jasmine's story, they felt empowered to share their experiences too. The school had no choice but to take action. In a meeting with the school board, Ms. Thompson was officially suspended. The school stated that they would take steps to ensure this never happened again, promising to review their anti-discrimination policies and provide anti-bias training for all teachers and staff. It was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough for Jasmine or her father. While the suspension was a victory, Mr. Andrews knew this wasn't over. The system had failed his daughter, and he wasn't going to let the school think this was a simple matter that could be swept under the rug. He had been fighting for justice his whole life, and this was just one more battle in a much larger war. He was determined to make sure no other child would face the same mistreatment. Jasmine, too, felt the weight of the moment. She had fought back against a teacher who had made assumptions about her because of the color of her skin. She had stood up for herself, for what was right. And now, the community knew what had happened. The story spread beyond the school, catching the attention of local news outlets and civil rights organizations. Jasmine and her father's fight had become a symbol for the many others who had faced similar mistreatment. The national conversation began. Activists and educators alike joined the call for school reform. Racial discrimination in schools had been ignored for too long, and now people were beginning to listen. The fight for change was gaining momentum, but Jasmine knew that her victory was just the beginning. "I'm proud of you, Jasmine," her father said as they sat down together after the school's decision. "You showed everyone what happens when you stand up for yourself. You didn't back down, and because of that, you've helped others find their voice too." Jasmine smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Her father was right. It wasn't just about the suspension or the teacher being punished. It was about creating change, about making sure that future generations of students wouldn't face the same struggles she did. Her courage had inspired others, and she knew that she couldn't stop fighting. While Ms. Thompson's suspension was a win, the real victory was that the conversation about racism in schools had been opened. More people were talking about the issues Jasmine had faced. More people were asking how they could change the system to prevent future incidents. More people were standing up just like Jasmine did. But even as the school took action, Mr. Andrews knew that real change would require more than just one decision. It would take continued effort, continued pressure from the community, and the involvement of everyone. Jasmine had taken the first step, but now it was up to everyone else to continue the work of creating a more just and equal education system. "I think we've just begun, Jasmine," her father said, giving her a reassuring smile. "This fight isn't over, and we'll keep fighting together." Jasmine nodded, feeling more determined than ever. She had done something important, and now, with her father's help, she would continue to fight for justice for all students, no matter their background. The suspension of Ms. Thompson was only the beginning of the change that was about to come. Although it was a victory for Jasmine, her father, Mr. Andrews, and the community, they knew this wasn't enough. It wasn't just about one teacher's actions. It was about changing the system, about making sure no other student would face the same kind of unfair treatment that Jasmine had experienced. After the investigation and Ms. Thompson's suspension, the school board announced several new policies aimed at preventing future incidents of racial bias. These policies included mandatory anti-bias training for all teachers, staff, and administrators. The school also promised to review how they handled situations involving students of different backgrounds and to increase diversity in the curriculum to ensure all students felt seen, valued, and heard. The community, already rallying behind Jasmine, began to push for even more change. Activists, local organizations, and parents joined together to support Jasmine's cause. They organized community meetings, where they discussed how to hold schools accountable for fair treatment and equal opportunities for all students, no matter their race or background. It was clear that Jasmine's fight had sparked something bigger, something that was spreading across the country. But even as the school took action, Jasmine and her father knew there was still more to be done. They wanted to make sure this wasn't a one-time change that would fade away in the coming weeks. They didn't want the conversation about racism in schools to stop. They wanted a long-lasting impact. Mr. Andrews became more active in advocating for educational reform. He worked with other parents and organizations to ensure that schools everywhere were teaching kids to respect one another, no matter their skin color. He also spoke at town hall meetings, sharing his daughter's story and explaining why schools needed to do more than just say the right things. They needed to act. Jasmine felt more empowered than ever. She had fought for her rights and won, but now she realized her fight was part of something much bigger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every student who'd ever been overlooked, underestimated, or unfairly judged because of the color of their skin. "I know we've made a difference, Jasmine," Mr. Andrews said one evening after a community meeting, "but we have to keep pushing. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, people who are brave enough to stand up for what's right." Jasmine smiled. She was proud of what she had achieved, but she knew this was just the start. There were still so many schools that needed to change, so many students who still felt like they didn't belong. But now, Jasmine knew she had the strength to keep fighting for a better future. The story of what happened to Jasmine quickly spread beyond her town. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was being talked about across the country. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences of facing discrimination in schools, and Jasmine's case became a symbol of hope for others who were fighting similar battles. Jasmine's courage inspired other students to speak out, to demand that they be treated fairly and with respect. The movement to stop racial bias in schools grew stronger as more and more people became aware of the issue. Teachers, students, and parents all joined together to make schools a safe place for everyone, regardless of race. But despite all the progress that was being made, Mr. Andrews knew there was still much work ahead. Systemic change couldn't happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of effort from people who cared about making the world a better place. But with each step forward, the community got closer to making that change a reality. As Jasmine stood next to her father at the front of the school's gymnasium at the end-of-year assembly, she felt proud. Her fight had made a difference, not just for her, but for everyone who had been unfairly treated. She had become a voice for those who felt voiceless, and she knew that her journey wasn't over yet. "I'm proud of you, Jasmine," Mr. Andrews said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done something that most people are too afraid to do. You've changed the conversation. Now, we keep going." Jasmine looked around the gym. Her school, which had once been a place of frustration and fear, now felt different. There was a sense of unity in the air, a feeling that things were starting to improve. The fight for equality wasn't over, but now there was a sense of hope, and Jasmine was determined to keep pushing, to make sure that every student, no matter who they were, would always be treated with respect. The story of Jasmine and her fight for justice is just one of many. Racial discrimination in schools is a problem that still affects so many students around the world. But Jasmine's bravery shows us that one person can make a difference. We can all be part of the change. If you've ever seen or experienced discrimination, whether at school or anywhere else, it's important to speak up. You are not alone. Together, we can make sure that every person, no matter their race, feels safe and respected. We can make our communities better by standing up for what's right. What will you do? Have you witnessed racism or unfair treatment? Share your story in the comments below and tell us how you think we can fight discrimination in schools. Your voice matters, and together, we can create a world where everyone is treated equally. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's spread the word about the importance of standing up for justice and equality. Jasmine's story is just one example of the change we can create when we stand together. Let's keep pushing for a world where no one has to fight alone. Together, we can build a future where respect, fairness, and equality are the foundation for everyone.